I'm going to present an overall survey of the American conservative movement. It's going to take several hours. It will be both from the point of view of history, for I am a trained historian and I'm very much interested in the background, and also from the point of view of personal testimony, because I've been part of this since about 1956, either as a participant or at least as a bystander paying a great deal of attention. So as we get into the modern period of the conservative movement, you'll find that I'm going to have to rely to some extent on people I've known, the incidents that I have participated in, the contacts that I have had personally. So it will be somewhat more personal as we get further into the presentation. The difficulty in discussing the American conservative movement is that as a movement, it has only existed since about 1944. It was a phenomenon that appeared almost unpredictably in the final phase of World War II. Yet in terms of the issues that were raised by the founders of the conservative movement in the post-war period, many of the issues have been fought out without any kind of resolution for at least 100 years prior to that time, and in some respects almost 200 years prior. So that the issues raised by the conservative movement tend to be fairly ancient, at least from the perspective of what constitutes ancient in the United States, that is, back to the foundations of the country in the 1760s and 70s. I'm going to make a series of points, but I suppose the point that I think is most important is this. The United States of America, as constituted by the Constitution, the ratification of the Constitution, has been a nation that has been overwhelmingly concerned with the issue of taxation and property. I think it would be difficult to make the case that the American Revolution came as a result of any single issue apart from the issue of taxation and property. There were religious issues deeply involved, but it was the taxation issue that was crucial. The issue then of who could collect the money, under what terms, and where the money went. And as I'm giving this presentation, the issue of taxation has arisen once again. There's a phenomenon known as the Tea Party movement. And so in a sense, I'm going to be talking about America from the first Tea Party to the contemporary Tea Parties. But to do that, I need to get into some of the background that shows exactly why it was that this issue of taxation and property was central to the battle over the Constitution and over the issue of the founding of the nation. And this issue did not go away. It was mixed with other issues, such as the issue of political sovereignty, who had the right to vote, who didn't have the right to vote, and on what basis. But ultimately, the vote in the United States keeps coming back to the issue of money, and that is who can take it from whom and on what terms. I am firmly of the opinion that an historian has to deal with at least three issues. And those three issues I can summarize very briefly in terms of three words each. The first word is follow the confession. The second phrase is follow the money. And then the third phrase is follow the media. And if you're going to talk about the development, certainly of a nation or of great events in the history of a nation, you have to ask those three questions. Follow the confession, In other words, what was the confession of faith of the major players? Follow the money, that is, who put it up, who spent it, and on what. And finally, the issue of follow the media. That is, how did anyone get his message out to the people, or at least to those people who were going to make a difference in the decision as to which direction the country went in. And I'm going to be doing that throughout this presentation. Unfortunately, what you find is that historians may latch on to two of those issues. They virtually never talk about all three. That is, the confession of faith, the issue of money, and the issue of media. The historians of ideas like to talk about the confession of faith, what do people say they believe in, and they may get into the issue, possibly, of how did the message get out, but they very rarely are going to spend a lot of time on who was benefiting, who was putting up the money, what did they expect to get for their investment. And historians of political forces and political movements, one of the first issues they raise is who was putting up the money and what did they expect to get out of it. And then they will go to the issue of the media. How do they get the message out? They tend not to talk about the confession of faith. They tend to think of money as the primary issue, political mobilization is the secondary issue, which means media, and then finally, what was the rationale? But they tend not to really believe in the rationale. I think all three are crucial. What did people believe and say they believed in? What were their ideas that mobilized others and attracted others? Secondly, how did they fund it? It isn't done for free. And why did they do it? What did they expect to get out of it? And then finally, how did the technology of the era, any particular era, enable them to get that message out? So those are fundamental issues that I'm going to be dealing with. That is, who articulated the ideas of the conservative movement, who funded the conservative movement, and who got out the message of the conservative movement to the individuals targeted by the leaders of that movement. I want to go back then, prior to the development of the movement, which I see as having taken place at the tail end of World War II, back to the foundational period of American history, at least with respect to the United States. I want to go back to the era of the Revolution, the American Revolution, which clearly began by 1775, but historians tend to believe that the real push towards it had begun 10 years earlier, about 1765, with what was known as the Stamp Act crisis. And it was an issue of money, but it was also an issue of politics. After the defeat of the French in North America by British forces, which was surely completed by 1763, it was clear to residents of North America that the French were no longer going to be a problem for the development of the western territories of the United States. Of course, it wasn't the United States yet. It was still British territory. The issue then was that it was time for Americans to be able to expand westward, take advantage of cheap land, which was a tremendous motivating factor for people coming to this country. It was literally the best land in the world, and it was the cheapest good land in the world, and people wanted to take advantage of it. There were restrictions on going west. The British government did not want that western development. They restricted colonists from going west, but the colonists went west anyway because there was no way to stop them. And the British, having funded this enormous war known as the French Indian War or the 7 Years' War, thought that the colonists should bear some of the tax burden. And Parliament passed a major tax and it was one of the politically most stupid taxes in the history of man. And that tax was a tax on official documents and printed paper. Now, why is that stupid? Because two groups get real upset: printers and lawyers. And if you want to have a revolution, you just get the printers allied with the lawyers, and you're going to have trouble. Because the lawyers had to have all of this specialized paper, expensive because of the tax associated with it, and the printers wanted to get out their newspapers as cheaply as possible, and they had to pay the tax too. And so it was seen as an attack on the spread of ideas, and it was harming two relatively tiny special interest groups. But they were articulate groups. They were people who could mobilize other people by means of the printed word and the spoken word in the case of the lawyers. And so the resistance began. And the resistance continued from 1765 through about 1767. And there was, in some cases, violence. Tax collectors were literally tarred and feathered, which is a horrible practice. They were threatened with violence. There were attempts to keep them from collecting the taxes. There was a true tax revolt. And that tax revolt, of course, gained great opposition from Parliament in Great Britain. But there was not much that Parliament could do about it at the time. That wasn't bringing in that much money. It was creating a lot of turmoil. But out of that turmoil came a phrase. And that phrase was no taxation without representation. And the issue was the colonists did not want to pay taxes into the central government of Great Britain because they had no say in Parliament. There were no representatives from Parliament who went to Great Britain and who could vote. The tax collecting agency was the colony, and in each of the colonies there were taxes collected, and the king's man was the governor, but the local legislatures were elected by the people, at least those who had the right to vote, in the colony. And that was representation, and the legislatures wanted control over the flow of funds. They wanted control over how much money the king's man, that is the governor and his agents, could extract out of their particular colony. And this was a fundamental judicial issue. It was an issue of political sovereignty. It was not just the money, as they say, it was the principle of the thing. And it really was, because if they can take a few cents from you, then in principle they can take whatever they can get their hands on. And if you did not have political representation, you couldn't control how much money would be taken out of the colony or what would be done with that money. And the colonists wanted the legislatures to control the money that was collected inside the colony and spent inside the colony. And over about a 2.5 or almost 3-year period, there was political confrontation, and finally the British government backed down on the taxation issue, leaving only one tax, which was a tax on tea. And they wanted to maintain it in principle because Parliament operated in terms of a fundamental principle, and that is the sovereignty of Parliament. There was no written British Constitution. There never has been one. Parliament was able to gain political power in 1688, which it did not surrender, power in terms of collecting money, spending the money. It had had it before, but it really had it after what was known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And Parliament asserted a sovereignty which it had not asserted prior to 1688. Now the colonies had all operated in terms of parliamentary sovereignty. There was no fundamental issue at stake on that, because Parliament did not directly tax the colonies. They taxed trade. They were allowed to tax trade, international trade. That was part of the British Empire. And colonists understood that. There was no big fight over that. But colonists resisted internal taxation, that is, taxation of people inside the boundaries of the individual colonies, and where that money was then going to be extracted from them and sent back to Great Britain. And so the Stamp Act crisis died out about 1767. But the political issue had been raised, and the phrase, no taxation without representation, had become a catchphrase for the resistance movement. And there was a continuing expansion of conflict as the British government sent British troops into the colonies for defending the country. That was the official reason, but the troops were housed in private houses, sometimes without pay, or at least not enough pay. They were visible. They were agents of the king, and they were resented because the colonists believed in the militias. They believed that men could be called into service within their colony, and that there was no big need with the French gone for all of these British troops. In other words, the success of Great Britain in driving out the French led to the crisis that took place over the next 20 to 30 years. From 1763 to 1783, that 20-year period at least, that wartime escalating battle was all over the success of the British in defeating the French. So we get to the issue then of the last remaining tax, and that was the issue of tea. The British Parliament had granted years before a monopoly of tea within the empire to the British East India Company. And the company was in financial trouble in the early 1770s. It couldn't sell all the tea because it was being undercut in terms of duties placed on the tea by non-British sources. Non-British sources were smuggling tea into the colonies, and no duty was being paid on the tea, and so the monopoly that had been granted to the British East India Company was of no particular value to it because it couldn't extract the monopoly profits because the smugglers of non-British tea were making the money. And of course, the most famous of the smugglers was John Hancock of Massachusetts. They couldn't convict. They usually couldn't get the juries to convict, but the British wanted it stopped. Well, there was only one way it was going to be stopped, and that was they had to cut the taxes on the tea. And so the taxes which had been collected in Great Britain, a substantial tax of about 25%, was repealed. That is, when the ships came into Great Britain, they didn't have to pay the tax before shipping out to the colonies. Well, that was a tremendous cost-cutting device. So that all that was left was just a relatively small tax that was left on the tea that the British East India Company would pay to the government when the tea was unloaded and sold to its distributors in the colonies. So in terms of money, it was literally pennies. It was not worth a great deal to the British. But they did use the money to pay the governors. Well, now that didn't sit well with the Americans, or the about-to-become Americans, because they wanted control over the payment of the money that went to the governors. It was a means of political power. So the issue was politics. So what happened was the tea could be priced below the price of the smuggled tea. In other words, the big tax, which had been collected in Great Britain, was cut. And that created the Tea Parties. And you think, wait a minute, they're rising up in rebellion because they cut the tax? And that's exactly what they did. The rebellion took place because the tax which had been collected in Great Britain was repealed for those ships that were coming to the colonies. And so there was just this tiny tax left, and now the price was competitive. The Americans fought that symbolic tax because of what it symbolized. It symbolized the right of Parliament to extract a tax, any tax, on the colonists inside the confines of the country. In other words, inside the borders. So in most cases, the resistance movement was successful and the ships just turned around. They just turned around. But in Boston, they didn't, because the governor was in on the deal. His sons had a special relationship. They were allowed to be part of the tax collecting process. He didn't want to give that up. And so he said that the ships, once they arrived, had to stay. They had 20 days to unload the tea, and at the time of the unloading of the tea, the tax would be paid. And the resistance began. This was in late 1773, in November. And the resistance built, and they said, you're not going to unload that tea. And the ship captain, who was operating as an employee of another American firm because the Americans owned at least 2 of those ships, the ship captain didn't unload it. He kept it on board. And the governor, he said, I want to go back. I'll just go back to Britain. And the governor said, no, you won't. You cannot take the ship out. And the colonists said, you cannot unload the tea. And so there was an impasse. And finally, on the final day in which the governor could unload that tea and forcibly take that tea, when the 20 days were up, and at that point the governor was going to take that tea off, a group of something like 100 of the colonists dressed up in kind of fake Indian garb went on to that boat, that ship, and threw the tea into the harbor. The only one anybody's ever heard of the group was Paul Revere. The rest of them were unknowns, mostly young, mostly 20 years old or younger. They were really kids having a little fun, is what they were doing. But it was an attack on private property. They did throw the tea into the harbor, and then when it was all done, they got out the brooms and they swept up the mess. So it was a symbolic attack. And that led to the closing of Boston Harbor the next spring, shutting down Boston, shutting down trade. It was called the Intolerable Acts. That's how the resistance movement phrased it. And from that point on, 1774 on, you began to see over the next year the resistance movement building, leading to the famous phrase that was never given by Paul Revere, the British are coming, the British are coming. Well, of course the British were coming. There was nobody else to come. Everybody was British. Now the Redcoats might have been coming, but the fact that the British were coming was really not a major issue since everybody was British. And that escalated, of course, to the American Revolution. And that battle went on for years. Now, in terms of the taxes involved, it was minimal. There were no fundamental taxes involved. It cost a lot in terms of inflation, in terms of loss of life, in terms of providing for the army, in terms of the organization of the militias. On both sides, it cost a fortune in terms of people's income. And officially, it was over that silly tax on tea. That's what had triggered the whole thing. And yet, it was pennies. It was not a fundamental issue in terms of the amount of wealth extracted. And in terms of the taxes that came after the war, the domestic taxes went up and stayed up. the British were out, the issue of no taxation without representation then switched to the home front instead of the international front. But at that point, that is after the defeat of the British, the Treaty of 1783, at that point the political battles switched back to the domestic issues. And that led, of course, to the, as we know, in those few years remaining from 1783 to the Constitutional Convention, 1787, those 4 years you had fought out the issue of who was going to exercise political power and on what judicial basis from that point on. That was the great turning point. It was, of course, it was a tax issue. Could the federal government now tax the people directly? That was a fundamental issue. Alexander Hamilton, the Federalist Papers, pointed to that as the issue that from now on the federal government has the ability directly to tax inside the United States, irrespective of the states. That had not been legal under the Articles of Confederation. And so what happened was the federal government, in effect, replaced Parliament as the collector of certain kinds of taxes. Those taxes mainly import taxes and duties, but also certain kinds of luxury taxes, especially the taxes on liquor and tobacco, what we call these days the sin taxes, or at least that's what they used to be called. Taxes on the consumption of alcohol. And those taxes were going to be collected. At that point, that is the issue of the revolution. As that revolution accelerated, on both sides you began to see the defense of each side essentially calling itself conservative. The defense of the right of revolution by the colonists was made overwhelmingly over the issue of the rights of Englishmen. That is, traditional rights to exercise freedom of thought, freedom of collecting taxes, freedom of sending someone to a legislature who would participate in deciding how many taxes would be imposed and on which group. The freeborn Englishman, the issue of the English personal liberties, was the basis of the defense of the revolutionary movement. Now the British said, well, these are revolutionaries. Of course, it wasn't called that then, but they were people who had revolted. They were radicals. They were people who were challenging the authority of the king officially. In the Declaration of Independence, it's always aimed at the king. They don't mention Parliament. But in fact, they're challenging parliamentary sovereignty. And Parliament was not about to have its sovereignty challenged. And so it fought. Each side did it on the basis of a defense of traditional English law. Each side did it on the basis of what they claimed was the English Constitution. Of course, there was not a written constitution. Each side defended the legality of its actions in terms of what we would call traditional appeals, appeals to the past, and specifically to appeals of Englishmen. In the British Parliament, there was one figure who understood the American position, who defended it, and who said it would be foolish to attempt to stop it, to stop this resistance movement. This man was Edmund Burke. And Burke was a man very much in favor of traditional English liberties. He'd been born in Ireland, but he was a member of the Church of England. He was a man who did not believe in large government. He was what we would call an advocate of the free market. And he believed that the Americans had a legitimate case in appealing to English liberties. And he said the country, this new country, is too big. It has too much freedom. It has too much wealth. It is foolish, simply foolish, to attempt to stop them from exercising their rights as Englishmen. And so as such, Burke became a defender of what we would call, in our country's history, a defense of the right of resistance, all on the basis of traditional conservative values. In the next part of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about Burke as the founder of modern conservatism.